A long time from now, Sherwin, the UN are going to be, I suppose, recognizing Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
And don't let the significance of this event at the United Nations be lost on you, Peter. Winnie Madikizela wasn't Mandela was not a senior government official for a very long time, and generally UN memorials in the General Assembly are a moment of respect, payment of tribute to former heads of government, former heads of state. So the South African mission here really pushing for this kind of recognition for clearly someone they regard as the mother of the nation. But it should not be lost that the international community, certainly here at the United Nations, does not necessarily recognize the heroines of various countries who have not held an official capacity in government, for example, a prime minister or a president of a country. I can tell you also, Peter, that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, will deliver the keynote address at that memorial, adding even greater significance to the event, followed by the President of the General Assembly. And I want to point out one of the speakers who will be speaking this morning, a woman by the name of Professor Gay McDougall. You'll remember in 1994 when Nelson Mandela, in a cream shirt, I believe it was, voted in the first democratic election in 1994, and to his right-hand side was a woman with braids and a necklace around her neck. Take a look at that picture, Peter. That is Gay McDougall, who will be speaking here in just a short moment. And also don't forget that the UN Memorial comes hot on the heels of a memorial we attended in Harlem last night, and just wonderful tributes, particularly from the African American community in Harlem, who not only called her the mother of South Africa's nation, but the mother of Harlem here in New York.
Talking about New York, I saw a report that you did earlier in the week, and reminiscing about the time that she made her first visit. I think it was her first visit outside of South Africa, post-1994, and the huge welcome that she received.
New Yorkers regard themselves as having played a very special role in the dismantling of apartheid. You know, part of the celebrations included members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and who can forget in the 1980s the overwhelming majority in both the Senate and the House of Congress, the representatives, passing critical sanctions legislation that really placed a great deal of economic pressure on the then National Party regime. Of course, as you mentioned, a ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue soon after Madiba's release in 1990, the first international trip being to New York, and of course at the time being hosted by the first black mayor of New York, Dave Dinkins, who is 90 years old today. The likes of Jesse Jackson, who I understand is in South Africa now, will attend the funeral tomorrow. Harry Belafonte was part of that host committee. So New Yorkers, and particularly people in Harlem, regard themselves as having been sort of, the first to welcome this golden couple, as they were regarded at the time. Nelson Mandela and Winnie Madikizela-Mandela also historically walking into the UN General Assembly to the raucous applause of member states. Who can forget the role that the Committee Against Apartheid, a special committee set up by the UN General Assembly, that really placed the apartheid regime and its dismantling at the center of their agenda. So the UN, and certainly to the South African government and the African National Congress in particular, the UN played a very, very important role. So the tribute that we will see in just about 30 minutes from now, it really speaks to that special relationship that certainly the United Nations had with the Mandela family.
You said that the UN Secretary General will be speaking and addressing that memorial. Has he said anything since the news of the passing of Mama Winnie?
All we got so far from his office was a statement from the Secretary General's spokesperson sympathizing with the loss to South Africa and certainly the Madikizela and Mandela families. Secretary General has been traveling in China, so he's just returned back in New York. But of course, last night, the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, was the keynote speaker at the Harlem event, in which she described this remarkable journey and a remarkable woman, and really, using quotes like, "You strike a rock, you you strike a woman, you strike a rock. Really a wonderful tribute from the United Nations. But we, as you say, we're looking forward to hearing from the horse's mouth, as you were, if you will, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking in just a few moments on Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
How has the media been in New York about Winnie Madikizela-Mandela? And I would imagine there'll be a few stories, a lot of stories maybe, hopefully, tomorrow in particular with the actual funeral. But since the passing, has it something that the American people have been able to see, particularly local television in New York?
The short answer is no. Unfortunately, the United States President Donald Trump tends to dominate the news cycle here in the United States. We have not seen the level of interest from the U.S. media as perhaps we saw when Tata Nelson Mandela died in December of 2013. It really hasn't been blanketing coverage here. It's certainly, we saw a few editorials, obituaries, if you will, as soon as the news emerged that she had passed on. But there really hasn't been a great deal of coverage on this. You know, the Russia investigation here, the intensification of the investigation by the special counsel Robert Mueller into President Donald Trump really is dominating. I mean, essentially, we're moving towards conversations about possible impeachment of the United States president. So I think South Africans can understand that why, the death of an icon in their midst is perhaps not translating as one might have expected here.
All right. Alicia's got a question for you, but just before she does that, I just wanted to get a sense of who's going to be there at the memorial later on this evening.
Well, the memorial is set to start at 11:30 a.m. our time, which is about 5:30 your time, Peter. So we're just moments away from that. South Africa's ambassador, Jerry Machila, will be the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, and then ambassadors representing each and every region of the United Nations. So Africa, the Middle East, Europe, South America, and so on, the Caribbean and the CARICOM states. So each ambassador will speak. Then the host country ambassador, the United States, will speak. Of course, United Nations is being hosted in New York by the United States government. And then there'll be some dignitaries, as I mentioned, Professor Gay McDougall, who is in that iconic picture standing next to Nelson Mandela as an observer from the United States at the time in 1994 as he cast that historic vote. And so that really gives you a sense. There'll be some music performances, I understand. But it's in essence that is kind of, it's a diplomatic event in a sense. So officials from various countries, various nations, as member states of the United Nations pay tribute.
And Sherwin, speaking of those high-ranking, of course, celebrities that will be attending the funeral, we do understand Naomi Campbell has already made her way to South Africa. But do tell us, we do understand there's a lot of South Africans, particularly in New York, where you are. How have they been allowed to pay homage to the fallen struggle stalwart? Particularly, we've seen a lot of condolences, events that have been organized across the country in her honor. How have they done it in the States?
I can only speak for what has happened here in New York, Alicia. Two memorials. There was one massive memorial held in Harlem last night. There's another one at the United Nations today. The South African mission to the United Nations opened a book of condolences for anybody, not only South Africans, to come and pay tribute. But as I've said, we haven't seen the level of enthusiasm, if you will, in terms of paying homage to Winnie Madikizela-Mandela here. Certainly not on the same level as we did when Tata died in 2013.
And Sherwin, just as we know, I mean, we do know Mama Winnie was, of course, a fighter for women's rights. What have some of the women's rights groups said? Particularly, I'm hoping we would hear a statement from on her passing. And of course, we've heard a lot of women saying that, we need to, as young women of this country, try and start emulating the figure that Mama Winnie was.
I'm going to let the Executive Director of UN Women speak for herself. She is traveling abroad at the moment. I understand that she's en route to the funeral in South Africa, but she did, as my understanding goes, is delivering a video, a message via video message at the UN Memorial in a short time. So let her speak for herself. What I will do is I will quote something from businessman Saki Makazoma, who spoke on her behalf at the Harlem Memorial last night. And he talked about why, he raised this question, Alicia, why the South African regime didn't kill Mama Winnie. Because they could have, he said. They did so many more with many other people, and she was much more troublesome than most. And I came to the conclusion, this is Saki speaking, that the reason why they did not do that is because they wanted to kill a people. They wanted to kill all of us through her. And she said, no, it's not going to happen through me.
And perhaps finally, I know that at this service that took place in Harlem, that a lot of women were wearing duks and headscarves, and I guess that's become quite iconic in telling the story and remembering Mama Winnie.
Absolutely. I mean, that was kind of what the message that went out with the invitation. Please come with your duks. I was looking to see if some of the guys were wearing duks, but they weren't, Peter. I hope you brought yours, certainly for the next couple of days. I'll be looking forward to that. But I will talk about, very briefly, Nsiki Lanford, a close confidant of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. Apparently, she was her personal assistant when Mama Winnie was a social worker working at the Baragwanath Social Development Department. And she talked to Peter about how much of a showstopper Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was. Quote, Winnie was a showstopper. You just couldn't keep walking straight. You had to turn. Her beauty, her stature, her figure, her build, her walk. And it was just unbelievable, she said. Wherever she went, she was a showstopper. And I can tell you, many women were showstoppers last night wearing those beautiful duks in tribute to the late Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
Sherwin, that's where we're going to leave it for the time being. Thanks very much indeed. That's our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, speaking to us from the UN building in New York. And this is 30 minutes away from a special memorial service that's taking place at the UN to honor Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela on her passing. And yeah, New York, as he was saying, is a town and a city that, as Sherwin was saying, contributed and feels like they were at the forefront in fighting apartheid. But we come back to South Africa now, where this cortege